Hello, welcome to the Gentle Rebel podcast. I'm Andy Mort, and this is a show about engaging with creative spirit, deep sensitivity, and playfulness to make more space for peace, meaning, and connection in a world that doesn't often give us chance to slow down and catch our breath. So it was last Wednesday, 22nd of May, 2024. My train arrived at 1:26 p.m. and it was going to be kind of tight to make the 2 p.m. start. And on top of that, the heavens had opened and was saturating the world below with rain. So all in all, the 30-minute walk home could have been more appealing, to be honest. So I decided, okay, I'm going to hunker down in a cafe around the corner. And from there, I'm going to watch the International Conference on Sensitivity Research that was organised and presented by Michael Pluess, Francesca Lionetti, and Corina Greven. And that's what I want to talk to you about in this episode of the podcast. I want to do a bit of a summary of what I heard during that conference. Now, academic presentations are not really easy for me to follow at the best of times. They're not my cup of tea. It takes a lot of bananas, shall we say, to stay focused. And even then, my brain just wanders and falters very, very easily. Add into that a busy coffee shop and some great opportunities for people watching. And let's say I'm glad they recorded the conference and I've been able to go back and revisit it and see what was said. Douglas Adams, the author, said, if you really want to understand something, the best way is to try and explain it to someone else. Now, I really want to understand this stuff. So I'm embarking on what currently feels like an impossible challenge to attempt weaving together what I understood of the research and to try and explain it in this podcast to the best of my ability and in ways that hopefully are understandable to other people who don't really get academic language. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. So, and I do this completely in a spirit of humility and invite those more qualified than me to hopefully clarify and contradict and correct any perceptions, interpretations, assumptions that I make during this. So please do get in touch with any of that stuff. Now, before I get into the content of the conference itself, I want to sort of jump to an end point of that day. There was a panel discussion at the end of the day, and this phrase "no cutoffs" was used, and it really caught my attention. It's like a collective agreement among the members of the panel that no cutoffs was a really important thing to prioritise. And despite my initial assumption, this wasn't actually a warning against repurposing old jeans by chopping them up into denim shorts for the summer. Instead, it was about how we measure and talk about high sensitivity in individuals and why it's kind of impossible and maybe undesirable to definitively measure and label someone as either an HSP or a non-HSP. The trait is more complicated, more complex than that. And there's no real way there's no sort of tipping point at which you can say someone is not an HSP and then suddenly they are an HSP if they score 0.1 more on a particular scale and fall into that box. And so, that really resonated. I was like, that's an important point to really emphasize, I think. And so through the conference, we heard from researchers who have built on the existing foundations to better understand the nature, the purpose, the characteristics of high sensitivity as a trait in different contexts and under various environmental and cultural conditions. And so there's new scales have been developed and they now exist for observing, measuring and assessing different factors associated with sensory processing sensitivity. So there's more kind of nuanced ways of looking at the different ways that high sensitivity kind of manifests and impacts people more than just that original HSP scale. that was developed in the early days by Elaine Aron back in 97 or whenever it was. And so I'm personally interested in how the research can, I guess, help us design and create and maintain favourable spaces and routines for more sensitive people, and to support those working with highly sensitive people with a better practical understanding of the associated traits. So we can actually create environments where highly sensitive people can flourish and can meet their potential and explore their potential. I will still refer to people who are high in sensitivity as HSPs as I go through this episode. But I do that as a general descriptor. I think I've always done this anyway, but like as a general descriptor rather than a categorical identity. Like I've always struggled with the idea that we have this binary thing of there's this group and there's this group, and there's like massive identity differences between them. No, it's not that as far as I'm concerned. So as it turned out, I could have actually made it home and still been able to put the kettle on, maybe even have 2 cups of tea before the conference actually began, because it had this beautifully chaotic start, which I really, really appreciated. Obviously not intentional and not desirable by those in charge. You love technology. So we joined the Teams meeting at 2:00 and watched as Art Aron, Art and Elaine Aron fame, tried unsuccessfully to get the sound working on his end. And I'm sure everyone in the group felt this like empathetic surge of mild, flustered panic. If you've ever had a situation like that where you're supposed to be starting and the technology is not working and you like, I don't know what to do. It's horrible. But Michael Pluess remained cool, on the outside at least, and calmly sorted out a Zoom room, invited everyone over. I think it was about 200 plus people attending at that point. So we all relocated to Zoom, and I just loved Michael's peaceful presence, even though he must have been tasting a little bit of stress beneath the surface at that point. He's one of those people I think naturally gives you a sense of feeling. You feel like you're in safe hands, I think, when he's at the helm. So it was great that he was there. And so once the technology then agreed to play ball, both Art and Elaine began the conference by highlighting some of the key collaborators that they've worked with over the years, notably a sensitive pumpkin seed sunfish, which is cool. Then they talked about some of the sensitivity research that's been significant that they've been involved in, and things that they've found important in this area through the years as well. One of Elaine's favourites shows how highly sensitive people are naturally less affected by cultural biases in their perception of stimuli. So, generally, whether a person's culture values individuals or they value the collective more highly has an impact on how they process and perceive data. And it turns out, as they did this cultural study with highly sensitive people, because of deeper processing, HSPs can actually perceive ideas, people and situations more objectively rather than being absorbed into the cultural perception like less sensitive individuals were. And so it's fascinating. And Elaine pointed out that, well, for better or worse, obviously environmental conditions have a greater impact and influence on a highly sensitive nervous system. A highly sensitive person's perception is actually less naturally swayed by environmental conditions, by the cultural values and beliefs in the world around them. And so this area, I think, really caught my attention, really interests me, because it speaks to the value of high sensitivity in the collective context. So going beyond, the impact of high sensitivity on individuals and then the impact of environments on individuals. Actually, there's so many areas that I think would be really interesting to explore as a result of this. Might it also mean that highly sensitive people are less likely to get swept up in groupthink and more likely to quietly question, mob-minded assumptions when the swells of, mob mentality occurs so often. I mean, it's why I think gentle rebellion feels like something that it is something that I see in a lot of highly sensitive people I work with. It's this quietly questioning, quietly pushing back against, quietly going against certain norms that might be, pushed on them. And so, I'd be really interested in learning about any research that follows this thread to see if there's a link in that direction. What could the upshot of that be for the voice of sensitivity more broadly, like the importance of having highly sensitive people in a collective context and for the voices of those people to actually be influential and to say, I think we're getting swept up in something here that's taking us away from certain objective ways of looking at things. I don't know. I'd be intrigued to see anything down that line. So then Art and Elaine tried through a few of the, research headlines. Give us a flavour of some of the recent work that's been going on in the sensitivity research field area. So that includes like HSPs have been found to demonstrate higher emotional responsiveness to positive and negative images and can perceive emotions in other people more easily. So there's been a study done into that. So kind of reinforcing that, I guess, intuitive sense that would be the case, and it's kind of supporting that. Highly sensitive people are equally likely to be sensation seekers as the general population. So this might be surprising, actually. Like there's no difference between HSPs and those who aren't HSPs in terms of the likelihood that they will be high sensation seekers. And so the nature of the sensation seeking might be different. The risk taking might be less in sensitive people, but the drive towards that high sensation seeking is still there. And they've also noticed a link between sensitivity to medications and the trait of SPS. And then Elaine talked about a study that's currently under review, which sounds really interesting and potentially helpful, which is exploring the reasons for continued confusion surrounding the trait of high sensitivity. And so I think it's kind of noteworthy because it will provide an opportunity at least to reevaluate and revise many of the assumptions that have become ingrained in popular discussions over the years around high sensitivity. So one of the reasons that the trait is sometimes on the receiving end of criticism is the abundance of information disseminated through online popular culture, which you probably come across it often portrays an incomplete or even incorrect picture of what we know to be true, at least the things we can be sure about when it comes to some of the research being undertaken. But she does also note a palpable shift towards a general acceptance and understanding of the evidence that firmly establishes high sensitivity as a real and as a natural trait. It's not just a subject for popular self-help books or some kind of metaphorical way of talking about something else. So that's a real shift, a real move on. So that's great. Other potential reasons for confusion that she talked about in this under review study include misconceptions about extroverted and high sensation-seeking behaviour. So these things are both common for highly sensitive people, highly sensitive extroverts, and as I just said, just as likely to have high sensation-seeking HSPs as the general population. So that can be a bit confusing. Additionally, most typical HSPs are less visible because they actually just go about their lives without realizing they're highly sensitive. So they're everywhere. But yeah, they might not realize, it might not be something that matters to the point of, going around telling everyone. I don't know. And yeah, well, half of HSPs are men. Men tend to be less visible as well, whether that's by choice, because it's like, I don't want to be kind of thought of in that way, or it's a lack of awareness. They've never heard of it, never considered it. There are also inherent difficulties that they talked about several times through the conference in observing depth of processing, which is at the trait's core. The trait revolves around this idea of deeper processing. And so it's hard to spot, when other people, and when we ourselves, hard to notice the pause to notice before acting. And so the original HSP scale misses essential aspects, and in Elaine's own kind of judgment, it really underestimates the importance of depth of processing and overestimates the importance of overstimulation. So I'll talk in a bit about what she said about that, but like the kind of negative skew of that original HSP test, where the majority of the points on it are kind of negatively worded. And so the impact of that on our perception of high sensitivity can't be underestimated. And yeah, HSPs in general also differ widely because of differential susceptibility, and how, because it's not a personality trait in the sense of dictating specific subjective preferences or tastes that we have in things. Like, not all highly sensitive people like the same things. Essentially, I think that's what I'm trying to say. And so the expression of high sensitivity looks completely different across individuals. Differential susceptibility, so the variations in people based on positive and negative environmental effects. So depending on the quality of an upbringing, or like negative, positive responses in a formative environment, have a huge effect on highly sensitive people, as some of the research that we'll go into demonstrates a little bit. And so this can sprinkle confusion on our expectations for how a highly sensitive person ought to sound, look, and act. So we might have a picture in our head of like what a highly sensitive person looks like, sounds like, whatever. And actually that can vary hugely. Jenni Kähkönen from Queen Mary University, London, started the 3 research presentations. And so she'd done one into highly sensitive children, which centered around teacher-reported sensitivity. So teachers were tasked with filling in a questionnaire, essentially, the highly sensitive child in school scale. So reporting on children in their classes. So this scale measures core sensitivity elements, such as a child easily noticing how others are feeling, thinking deeply about things, being very sensitive to injustice, getting easily distracted when other children are fighting, appearing to feel things deeply, and trying hard to avoid making mistakes or forgetting things. So these observations were made by teachers about the children. And they were also consistent factors across the 2 schools that they looked at in Switzerland and the UK, and identified these factors across equally in boys and girls. They found a link between overstimulation and core sensitivity scales in the UK, but not in Switzerland. Overstimulation being indicated if a child struggling to focus in loud and chaotic situations, needing quiet time after an exciting activity, and feeling easily overwhelmed when under pressure. Jenni said if a school environment is very good, the child might not display overstimulated behaviours, which may indicate that the environment is conducive to calm, nervous system regulating conditions. Or it might just suggest that the child only displays overstimulated behaviours in contexts where they feel safe to do so. So it might be actually they kind of shut down a little bit at school, and then they display those behaviours once they get home at the end of the day. So this kind of suggests that we need more, probably more studies to widen this out to other areas. But I think it was suggested that the school in Switzerland was a smaller school, so the environment and the one in the UK was in urban London, which is probably more likely to be quite busy and less space, those kinds of things. I don't know exactly what those schools were like, but yeah, interesting. Several other differences existed between the two schools in terms of what they found. So in Switzerland, the teacher reported sensitivity predicted higher social competence and grades, and there was no correlation between those two things in the UK. There was a link to predicting internalizing symptoms in the UK, but not in Switzerland. So internalizing symptoms like worry, signs of worry in a child. And this wasn't found in Switzerland, but it was found in the UK. And higher sensitivity predicted lower externalizing symptoms. So attention issues, hyperactivity, conduct problems in both countries. So there was less of that in the sensitive kids in both of the countries. Yeah, the research supports the notion that more sensitive children can benefit from calmer working environments and times of quiet to recharge after activities that excite the nervous system, and might stimulate them. Teachers should be mindful that social or time-pressured tasks may impact more sensitive children, but also that sensitive children can thrive when the conditions are favourable. So it's about providing a platform on which they can actually flourish, rather than just mitigating overstimulation. It's like, what can we give these children so that they can, really explore their potential and flourish? It's worth, in that respect, considering the impact of things like class size and classroom design when it comes to supporting children to thrive in that way. So, yeah, it was great. The second presentation was from Veronique de Gucht, who is based at Leiden University. And she was exploring whether high sensitivity might be considered a blessing or a challenge. This is a question we hear a lot, isn't it? Is it a blessing or a curse? And she was sharing findings from studies into sensitivity, giftedness, and resilience to kind of, sort of put these questions, these ideas into a scientific framework. So Veronique introduced the new Sensory Processing Sensitivity Questionnaire, the SPSQ, which I discovered a couple of days ago is now available in English. It was just available in Dutch. I will put a link in the show notes to that questionnaire. But it's essentially an updated tool for understanding and measuring the different traits of sensitivity. And so it covers 6 categories and really offers a more nuanced and comprehensive approach to understanding those different elements of sensitivity. It has a negative dimension and a positive dimension. So it's looking at the negative aspects of sensitivity as it might be perceived, and the positive aspects of sensitivity, and building that picture based on that. So the study found that those who score more highly for sensory discomfort and emotional and physiological reactivity, so they're the two scales of the negative dimension, sensory discomfort and emotional and physiological reactivity. People who score more highly on those are more likely to experience physical or psychological symptoms. So these were fatigue, physical complaints, depression, and anxiety. On the other hand, there was a much lower link between those same symptoms, fatigue, physical complaints, depression, and anxiety, and someone who scores higher on the positive dimension. And so the factors on the positive dimension: sensory sensitivity, sensory comfort, social affective sensitivity, and aesthetic sensitivity. And I mean, I was thinking, these two dimensions of sensitivity, having positive and negative factors divided in that way, it feels like a really helpful step forward, I think, in measuring and understanding these different elements of sensitivity. And it should allow us to see the impact of these different sensitivity scales across various contexts. There's a lot more flexibility, I think, and opportunity to look at it in a variety of contexts and other sorts of research, I think. And that's what Veronique talked about that. And she shared the results of a study exploring the link between giftedness and sensory processing sensitivity, which is, something that is sort of maybe assumed or talked about quite a lot. And the study found that gifted individuals scored lower on the negative dimension scales, so sensory discomfort and emotional and physiological reactivity, than the general population. And there was no real discernible difference when it came to the positive dimension. The sensory sensitivity, sensory comfort, social affective sensitivity, and aesthetic sensitivity, there was no higher score by those that scored high on the giftedness scale than the general population. So nothing in these findings to suggest sensory processing sensitivity as a trait makes an individual more likely to be gifted, or that gifted people are more likely to have the SPS trait. So there's something else going on there. And then a follow-up study explored whether resilience reduces the adverse effects of heightened sensitivity. And so this found that higher scores for the negative aspects of sensitivity on that negative dimension correlate with lower resilience and higher symptoms. And then higher scores for the positive sensitivity correlate with greater resilience and lower symptoms. So this does suggest that resilience has the potential to alleviate the negative impact of SPS on individuals. Exploring what that resilience looks like for sensitive people, and how that can be nurtured, I suppose. So these results also speak to the potential benefits of increasing awareness of and improving our relationship with the positive aspects of sensory processing sensitivity. It's particularly crucial for practitioners to consider when working with HSPs. Interventions can help highly sensitive people cope with sensory discomfort and emotional and physiological reactivity, those negative aspects, and enhance the positive aspects of sensitivity, thereby improving alignment with the environment and supporting the individual to thrive in that context. Dr. Ellen Assery from King's College London then delivered the third presentation. And so her research was delving into how high sensitivity relates to mental well-being and whether genetic or environmental factors correlate with greater depression, anxiety, and autistic traits in highly sensitive people. And so this was a study that took me a little bit longer to, I'm still not fully understanding what this is, but it measured subjective well-being using questionnaires and self-reports to create a comprehensive picture of personal well-being. And so this found that individuals with higher sensitivity scores reported feeling less hopeful, less optimistic, and less happy. And there was no significant difference in curiosity, gratitude, ambition, and grit. So this was suggesting that while highly sensitive people may experience aspects of psychological well-being, so maybe those things like curiosity, gratitude, ambition, grit, these things that kind of bring a psychological well-being to us, those subjective factors like feelings, feeling hopeful, feeling happy, feeling optimistic, they might still feel dissatisfied or unhappy with their life. And so the results actually also highlighted an interesting link between high aesthetic sensitivity and increased psychological well-being. So aesthetic sensitivity referring to the ability to perceive and appreciate beauty through the senses, essentially. So, being deeply moved by art, by music, by nature, by flavours, by scents. And we might connect the dots here with the previous research that I mentioned, and question whether our relationship with art and creativity and beauty can help build resilience and mitigate the adverse effects of sensitivity. So that could be a route to enhancing the positive dimension of sensitivity in an individual's experience. And that speaks to something that I have an intuitive sense could be true, but it would be fascinating to explore if and how we might be able to deepen our aesthetic sensitivity, whether that is a possibility, so that we can then increase psychological well-being in that respect. And also whether that increased psychological well-being through aesthetic sensitivity, does that lead to greater feelings, that subjective well-being, greater feelings of well-being. So interesting. The twin study that was at the heart of this also revealed that sensitivity and mental health outcomes are primarily influenced by shared genetic factors rather than environmental ones. And so this means that the same genetic traits that lead to high sensitivity also predispose individuals to depression, anxiety, and autistic traits. However, despite a correlation between these two things, there's obviously a link, nothing indicates a causal relationship. And so Dr. Assery was really clear to and sort of careful to emphasize that there's no correlation does not equal causation. And so she suggests that a better understanding of the genetic basis of sensitivity could help identify predispositions to anxiety, depression, and autistic traits, which would then enable more useful and targeted interventions. I think we might also consider what underpins our subjective judgment of well-being as well, that feeling less happy, satisfied, hopeful. Is this a story that we can shift in time? And how would that be? And so working with highly sensitive people in particular to work with the function rather than seeing high sensitivity as a dysfunction, rather than trying to, squeeze highly sensitive people into a preconceived box of what normal functioning should be like, to actually embrace a sense of positive movement towards well-being as highly sensitive people experience it on their own terms. Yeah. So at this point, I think there was a short break in the presentations. It must have been brief because the next session had already started by the time I got back from, let's say, ordering more bananas. So Dr. Sophie Wen was looking at HSP overstimulation, how it fluctuates during the day and across different contexts. And this was using a diary study where participants would gauge and record levels of overstimulation, environment, moods, fatigue, and pleasantness of stimuli in the environment. So sounds, sights, smells, tastes, touches. They record that through the day. So I don't know whether it was kind of getting a little thing on the phone to say, okay, how are you feeling right now? Like what, and like fill out these things. And so, yeah, just gauging that over time. And they found that overstimulation fluctuated throughout the day for everyone, regardless of sensitivity, with the highest levels being between 5 and 6 p.m. So kind of at the end of the working day. And then overstimulation decreased later into the evening. There was an increase across the board in public spaces, especially when surrounded by other people, and reports of negative moods and fatigue also correlated to overstimulation. Overstimulation also increased with reports of unpleasant sounds, lights, smells, tastes, and touches. And as you might be able to predict, overstimulation was significantly higher for highly sensitive individuals when their fatigue level rose. But overstimulation decreased when they reported higher levels of pleasant sounds, visual stimuli, and positive moods. And this shift was much more prevalent for more sensitive than less sensitive individuals, which is in keeping, consistent with the theory that highly sensitive people are more significantly impacted by both positive and negative environmental conditions. And so these findings reinforce the need for awareness of variations in overstimulation and really to work with those fluctuations, rather than trying to fight against them. How often do we do that? Try and do things at the wrong time of day or the wrong part of the week or whatever. And actually understanding these fluctuations can really help us work with ourselves rather than setting ourselves up for failure. So focusing on rest and sleep quality as well can mitigate that fatigue that is correlated to more overstimulation. Increasing pleasant auditory and visual stimuli through things like music, ambient lighting, in environments that we can control, obviously, and then in environments where you have less control, using things like noise cancelling headphones, tinted glasses, things that sort of rein in that sensory overstimulation. Okay, and then Robert Marhenke from the University of Innsbruck gave the second flash talk, which was on the idea of attentional capture and sensitivity. So things that capture our attention and whether we are more distractible, I suppose, as highly sensitive people. And so he introduced the concept of selective attention, which has been assumed to be lower in highly sensitive people, because, as we know, HSPs process information more deeply, are aware or more aware of subtle stimuli, are more easily overwhelmed and distracted by extraneous stimuli, and have a lower ability to filter out irrelevant information. And so he explored this through two theories of attentional capture. There's the bottom-up theory, which essentially is our attention being drawn to a stimulus based on the properties of that thing. So like, if something has bright colours, you're like, oh, that's caught my attention. It's got bright colours or distinctive characteristics. like, oh, that's got a funny big thing on it, or whatever. And then top-down theory of attentional capture is where attention is directed by preconceived intentions or goals or knowledge, something that we are already looking out for. And so we're looking for it. The study found that individuals high in sensory processing sensitivity were not more easily distracted by striking elements in the bottom-up experiment. And results from the top-down experiment found that highly sensitive individuals were less biased by their own intentions and goals. So they were, in fact, better at ignoring distractions, which might be surprising. The HSPs are not more easily distracted by environmental stimuli, even though, you're taking in more, processing deeper, like unable to filter out information as easily as others might. But this, I guess, aligns to that study I mentioned at the start, the one that Elaine and Aaron highlighted, that shows that cultural influences on perception don't impact highly sensitive individuals as much. So even though HSPs are more affected by their environment, it doesn't actually inhibit their ability to process and perceive it with a greater sense of objective discernment, which I think is very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. And then Sophia Bibb delivered the third and final flash talk of the day, which was her inaugural research talk as a first-year PhD student at Ohio State University. She was sharing her research into the effects of sensitivity and childhood family conflict on objective stress responding. So there's this previous assumption that stress affects highly sensitive people more than less sensitive individuals, despite there being mixed results in studies about this. And so Sophia looked at the effects of different stress types on sensitive individuals. Predictable threats elicit a fear response, so a time-locked reaction to a tangible stressor. And then unpredictable threats cause anxiety, so anxiety being an anticipatory state of chronic arousal. So this uncertainty that means, something could or might not arrive in a way you can predict. And the research examined the relationship between sensory processing sensitivity, childhood family conflict, and objective stress response. It found a correlation between high family conflict in childhood and increased reactivity to unpredictable threats later in life. However, it showed no relationship between sensory processing sensitivity and reactivity to unpredictable threats for those who didn't experience family conflict growing up. And so this suggests that sensitivity, SPS alone, doesn't equate to greater anxiety. And then interestingly, individuals low in SPS who experienced family conflict actually showed lower reactivity to unpredictable threats than those who hadn't. There's lots of interesting dynamics going on there. And Sophia concluded from this research that highly sensitive people are not inherently more biologically reactive to stress. They may experience greater sensitization to childhood stress, particularly to sustained unpredictable stresses, which is consistent with the diathesis stress component, which indicates that greater reactivity in a sensitive individual is contingent on early sensitization events like high family conflict. And so understanding the interaction between SPS and biological stress reactivity can inform approaches to psychopathology and interventions for highly sensitive people. So understanding that differential susceptibility again, and working with individuals on an individual basis, really, really important. Yeah, so the 3-hour conference concluded with a panel discussion about measuring sensitivity. I'll admit, as is probably the case for you right now, by this point in the live event, my brain was frazzled and I couldn't process anything. I was beyond the banana. So I was grateful to have the recording to go back and watch later. But the panel was exploring the strengths and limitations of how sensitivity is currently observed, measured, and applied in both research and practice. And it was at this point Elaine Aron reiterated the centrality of depth of processing to high sensitivity and how challenging it can be to observe and to measure the depth of processing. And Veronique de Gucht pointed out that very few people, would choose to answer a question. If there was a direct question about depth of processing, not many people are going to answer that in a way that makes it feel like they've got no depth or sound like they've got no depth. And so, respondents are much more likely to answer questions based on what's socially desirable rather than what is necessarily true. And this is always going to be a problem with any sort of questionnaire around this sort of stuff, that you've got to answer it as truthfully as possible. Otherwise, you're going to get skewed results. And so, yeah, that's always a factor involved in this kind of thing. And Elaine laments the negative flavour, as I said earlier, of that original highly sensitive person scale, which, yeah, she talked about it being developed through kind of exploratory processes. Like it was something that it wasn't built on the foundations of an initial theory with really well-established definitions. It was kind of like, okay, we're making this up as we go along. We've got this idea of sensory processing sensitivity. We're trying to work out, what are the factors involved in this. And so she talked about, if she could go back and start again, I guess, she would emphasize the depth of processing more and focus less on the overstimulation part. But I was kind of like, Elaine, you can cut yourself some slack. I feel she was pretty hard on herself about the whole thing. And, it's a case of doing what you can with what you have at the time. And SPS, completely new, unexplored field to discover and uncover. So this is just how these things start and evolve imperfectly and in ways that we're probably going to regret later. There's certainly going to be factors that we regret and wish we'd done differently. It's always the case with the benefit of hindsight, isn't it? So the 6 new scales provide a richer and more detailed understanding, I think, of different elements of sensitivity: emotional and physiological reactivity, sensory sensitivity, sensory comfort, sensory discomfort, social affective sensitivity, and aesthetic sensitivity. Just to remind you again, these scales provide greater potential flexibility for future research and are already being kind of integrated into collaborations with other fields of study unrelated to high sensitivity. So, yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more, interesting research, hopefully, over the coming years that cross disciplines and fields. The panel also discussed the need for specialised training to understand the functional diagnosis of sensory processing sensitivity. So, in other words, we need to move away from what I think I heard described as differential diagnosis, which I believe means categorising high sensitivity as essentially as a dysfunction when you compare it to normal functioning, rather than a core biological function of an individual. So seeing biological sensitivity as just a different way of being wired. So it's completely normal function for a highly sensitive person to be a highly sensitive person. And so this requires knowledge and acceptance of the core sensitivity traits in human beings. Okay, I think we're there. How's that been for you? Let's just finish where we started and return to those 3 words: no cut-offs. And no, I'm still not talking about denim shorts. While many individuals, as well as teachers and parents, might desire, might seek definitive answers. Is this child an HSP or not? It's not possible, and I don't think it's desirable to treat sensitivity in this way. Environmental factors complicate it, and careful consideration is needed regarding the potential harm that an individual might face if the HSP label is used or not about them. And so it's kind of weighing, is this going to be a useful label in this particular context, or is it actually going to be less helpful? So, yeah, I think that's great. And I guess I felt heartened by this conference, especially after watching it back, dare I say, several times, and beginning to grasp what was being communicated. I really hope that we might see an increasing flow of discoveries related to SPS across disciplines, fields, and backgrounds. There are so many elements that I would love to see explored in the future. So I look forward to finding out where the research goes next. I guess I still get most excited when highly sensitive people see themselves reflected in descriptions of the trait, so they can begin that journey of growth in self-understanding, acceptance, and awareness, and explore who they've always been in light of their sensitivity, not in opposition to it, and to consider the sort of potentials within it as they think about the future. So, yeah, it's all good stuff. I would love to hear from you if you're someone who knows what they're talking about in these things, and you sort of like need to clarify or confirm or contradict something that I've included here. Then please do. I'm open to being taught what was actually said. But yeah, and if I would love to hear also the things that you would love to see researched in relation to high sensitivity. I think it feels like, there's scope for that, for suggestions, for maybe, thinking about what would it be useful to actually know? What would it be useful to actually understand in different fields across disciplines and areas regarding high sensitivity, in order to raise awareness, to support individuals, to change cultures, and to change society. I think there's a huge aspect to high sensitivity as an evolved biological function of humanity as a whole, that it doesn't get utilized for. So what's that? And maybe, is there scope to go into disciplines like the social sciences and other areas beyond psychology? I don't know. Do get in touch. Get in touch via the website, andymort.com, or on social media. You can find me anywhere. But I hope you found this helpful, and I hope your brain is not quite as frazzled as mine is right now. I've revisited the state I was in last Wednesday. Anyway, I will leave it there, and I will return soon with another episode of the Gentle Rebel podcast. And until then, do remember that you are an artist, that the world needs your art. Now go and make somebody's day. Bye-bye.